Welcome to our horror channel, Fear the Shadows. Do not forget to subscribe if you want to see more. And now let's begin. 3, 2, 1. I have seen Sherlock Holmes stare down murderers without so much as a blink. I have watched him walk calmly through rooms where the dead still seemed unwilling to surrender their final breath. Yet there was one evening, one impossible evening, when I saw his hand tremble. Only once. The envelope had already fallen to the floor. Its wax seal had broken beneath his boot, though I could not remember hearing him step forward. He did not speak. Neither did I. Outside Baker Street, London drowned beneath cold rain, each drop striking the windows like impatient fingertips. The fire crackled behind us, but the warmth never reached the room. Holmes bent slowly, lifted the envelope with unusual care, and studied the handwriting. His face betrayed nothing. His eyes betrayed everything. "My dear Watson," he whispered. No, not whispered, remembered. Had anyone else been standing there, they would have believed he was merely reading a familiar name. But I knew Sherlock Holmes. Something had found a way beneath the armor of his impossible mind. Only later would I understand why. Only much later would I discover that some letters are never meant to arrive. Allow me, then, to begin where the nightmare truly started. It was a bleak November morning, years after my own funeral. Death, strange as it may sound, grants a man remarkable perspective. If these pages have reached you, then events unfolded much as I feared. I know how absurd that sentence appears. Believe me, no one understood absurdity better than Sherlock Holmes. The post arrived shortly after 9. Mrs. Hudson carried the morning letters upstairs with her usual grace, apologizing for the dreadful weather before placing the bundle upon the table. There were advertisements, a bill, 2 newspapers, one unsigned invitation, and finally, an aged envelope unlike the others. This paper had yellowed with time. The corners had softened as though countless hands had hesitated before touching it. There was no postage stamp, no postal mark, no indication that it had passed through any office in England. Only a single line written across the front. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Nothing more. Holmes ignored the remaining correspondence. He lifted the old envelope between 2 fingers, closed his eyes briefly, then held it beneath the lamp. "Irregular fibers," he murmured. "Handmade paper, at least a decade old." I laughed. "You determined that without opening it?" He offered no answer. Instead, he asked a question. "Watson, who knew I still occupied these rooms? Half of London." "No," he shook his head. "Who knew I would still occupy them today?" His remark struck me as oddly specific. I dismissed it. That would prove to be my first mistake. Holmes broke the brittle wax seal. A single sheet slid onto the table. Before either of us touched it, Holmes froze. He leaned closer, not to read, to observe. The ink. I looked. It appeared perfectly ordinary. What's wrong with it? It has aged. So, it has aged exactly as the paper has. I frowned. What does that mean? It means the letter was written when the envelope was sealed. I smiled impatiently. Naturally. "No, Watson." His voice grew unusually quiet. "It means no one wrote this recently." A cold draft wandered through the sitting room. Neither of us had opened a window. Holmes unfolded the paper. His expression remained unreadable until his eyes reached the signature. For several long seconds, silence consumed the room. Finally, he handed the page to me. My heartbeat slowed, then nearly stopped. The handwriting was mine. Every curve, every stroke, every imperfection earned through years of medical notes and hurried battlefield reports. Impossible. I searched desperately for signs of imitation. There were none. At the bottom stood a signature I had written thousands of times. John H. Watson. My own name. The date above it chilled me even further. It bore a year that had not yet arrived. I forced a laugh. A remarkable forgery. Holmes remained perfectly still. No, you can't possibly believe. I believe facts. His eyes never left the page. The question is whether we are prepared to accept them. I reached for the letter. The first sentence stole the air from my lungs. My dear Holmes, if you are reading this, I have already been dead for several years. The room seemed to shrink around us. I read the sentence again and again. The words refused to change. Below them waited another line, one that neither of us spoke aloud for what felt like an eternity. Do not begin investigating the Ashcroft murders. They have not happened yet. The fire suddenly cracked so violently that I nearly dropped the page. Holmes did not flinch. He merely stared into the flames with that distant expression I had come to recognize. Whenever Holmes looked like that, it meant he had already stepped several moves ahead of everyone else. Even me, especially me. At last he stood, reached for his violin, and without playing a single note, placed it gently inside its case. He put on his coat. "The game," he said softly, "has begun, but there hasn't been a murder." No. He opened the apartment door. Not yet. Behind us, forgotten upon the table, the letter moved. Not by much, only enough for its final page to reveal one hidden sentence neither of us had noticed. A sentence written in my own unmistakable hand. "Do not let him fall asleep. There is a peculiar silence that settles over London just before dawn. Most men mistake it for peace. It is not peace. It is hesitation. The city seems to pause, as though every chimney, every cobblestone, every sleeping soul waits for permission to breathe again." Sherlock Holmes stood motionless beside the window of Baker Street, watching the darkness dissolve beneath a curtain of gray morning rain. He had not slept. Neither had I. The letter rested upon the table between us, untouched since the previous evening. Every instinct I possessed urged me to throw it into the fire. Holmes would not allow it. "There is no such thing as coincidence," he said quietly. "Only causes whose footprints are too small for ordinary men to notice." I looked once more at the impossible pages. My handwriting, my signature, words claiming to have been written years after my own death. Reason insisted the letter was fraudulent. Yet reason offered no explanation. Holmes suddenly reached across the table and folded the final page beneath the others. "You need not read that sentence again. I wasn't planning to. You were." His eyes remained fixed on the rain outside. "You have read it 17 times. I stared. "I never counted." "You did not." A faint smile crossed his face. "But your breathing did." I had long ago abandoned the hope of understanding how Holmes arrived at such observations. The remarkable thing was not that he noticed what others ignored. It was that he noticed things no one imagined could be noticed at all. Without another word, he opened the letter once more. His gaze moved directly to the second paragraph. Not the first. Not the warning concerning the murders. The second. "Listen carefully, Watson," he read aloud. "By the time you receive this letter, the first victim has already chosen the hour of his own death, though he believes he has chosen nothing at all." Holmes lowered the page. "What do you hear? A prediction? No. A threat? No." He tapped the paper gently. "A physician?" I frowned. "What has medicine to do with it?" "Everything." He walked toward the bookshelf, removed an atlas of London, and spread it across the desk. "The writer understands inevitability. I still fail to see. A doctor does not merely observe death. He looked directly at me. He studies the road leading toward it." For a brief moment, I felt strangely uncomfortable. Not frightened, recognized, as though whoever had written the letter truly understood how I thought. Holmes drew a small circle upon the map. "Find Ashcroft. There is no Ashcroft district." "I know. There is no Ashcroft Street either." "I know. No hospital." "I know. No church." "I know." My patience finally broke. Then what exactly are we searching for? Holmes folded the map. The place that does not yet have its name. I confess I almost laughed. Sounded absurd, even for him. Yet experience had taught me that Holmes often spoke in riddles only because reality itself had not yet caught up with his conclusions. Late that afternoon, Inspector Lestrade arrived unexpectedly. His coat dripped rainwater across Mrs. Hudson's carpet. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Holmes answered before either of us spoke. "Someone has disappeared." Lestrade blinked. "Yes. You received the report less than an hour ago." "Correct. The missing gentleman is unmarried." Lestrade's eyebrows lifted. "He is. And wealthy. Very." I could no longer remain silent. "Holmes, how in heaven's name?" Lestrade interrupted. "His banker filed the report." Holmes merely nodded. As expected. The inspector removed a notebook from his pocket. "Name's Edward Fairchild." Neither Holmes nor I recognized it. "He vanished yesterday evening," Lestrade continued. "No signs of violence. His servants insist he simply walked out after receiving an unsigned note." Holmes became unusually attentive. "What happened to the note?" "It disappeared." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. Only then did I remember the letter lying upon our table. Another unsigned message. Another impossible warning. Lestrade cleared his throat. "There's something else." He hesitated. "My men searched Fairchild's study. And we found a calendar." He opened the notebook. Every date was crossed out except one. "What date?" Lestrade answered softly. 3 weeks from today." Holmes closed his eyes. He did not appear surprised, only disappointed. "As I feared." Lestrade stared. "You expected this?" Holmes ignored the question. Instead, he unfolded my letter once more. His finger rested upon a single sentence halfway down the page. One I had somehow overlooked. "Edward Fairchild will disappear before anyone believes a crime has occurred." The room became utterly silent. Lestrade stepped closer. "Where did you get that?" "A private matter. I'll need to examine it." "No, Holmes. No." There was something in Holmes' voice I had heard only a handful of times. Finality. Lestrade recognized it as well. He sighed heavily. "Very well." As the inspector departed, Holmes remained motionless beside the fireplace. The flames reflected in his pale eyes. "They're already behind." "Who?" "Everyone." He turned toward me. "The first murder has not occurred." I nodded. "Exactly. No, Watson." His expression hardened. "It has." I felt my stomach tighten. "But Fairchild is merely missing." Holmes picked up the letter. "The writer never said the first victim would be found dead." He pointed toward the sentence once more. "The first victim has already chosen the hour of his own death." Holmes spoke so quietly I almost failed to hear him. "A man may become a victim long before his body dies." That evening we left Baker Street beneath a sky the color of old ashes. London seemed different, not because its streets had changed, because I had. Every passerby appeared to be walking toward an appointment they did not know they had made. Every shadow seemed patient, waiting. As our carriage disappeared into the rain, I glanced back toward the windows of our rooms. For only an instant, I thought I saw someone standing there, watching us leave. The figure wore my face. There are places in this world that seem to reject the passage of time. I do not mean the grand cathedrals whose stones have endured for centuries, nor the forgotten villages where old habits cling stubbornly to fading generations. I speak instead of those rare houses that appear to inhale every tragedy committed beneath their roofs and exhale them only after decades have passed. Such places are not abandoned by life. They are abandoned by mercy. 3 days after Edward Fairchild vanished, Sherlock Holmes led me beyond the edges of London to a forgotten estate that no modern map seemed eager to acknowledge. The carriage left us at the end of a narrow road swallowed by dense yew trees. Their twisted branches reached across the path like skeletal fingers, shutting out what little daylight the November sky still possessed. The silence there felt unnatural. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the grounds. Ahead stood Ashcroft House. Its name was carved into a weathered stone pillar, nearly erased by moss and rain, as though the earth itself had tried to bury the memory of its existence. I immediately recalled Holmes unfolding the old map in Baker Street and searching for a place that did not yet have a name. Now, standing before that crumbling mansion, I wondered whether he had already known we would find it, or whether the letter had simply led us where fate intended. Holmes paused only briefly before the rusted iron gate. He rested his fingertips against the cold metal, closed his eyes for several seconds, and then entered the grounds without a word. I had long since stopped asking how he reached conclusions that seemed to belong more to instinct than reason. The estate had surrendered itself to decay many years earlier. Broken statues leaned at impossible angles among waist-high weeds. Empty fountains collected rainwater black as ink. Dead ivy strangled every wall, while shattered windows reflected the gray sky like blind eyes unwilling to witness another passing season. The house itself possessed a strange dignity despite its ruin. It was less the appearance of a neglected home than that of a patient old monarch refusing to collapse before unwanted spectators. As we crossed the front steps, I became aware of something I could neither explain nor dismiss. There were footprints, fresh ones, not ours. They began at the front door. They ended nowhere. The damp layer of dust covering the entrance displayed every impression with remarkable clarity. Several sets of boots had entered recently, yet none had ever departed. Holmes examined the marks only once before continuing inside. The great entrance hall greeted us with stale air carrying the scent of wet timber, mold, and extinguished fireplaces. Our footsteps echoed far longer than they should have. Every sound lingered. Every movement seemed reluctant to die. Portraits still hung upon the walls despite decades of neglect. Rain had stained many beyond recognition, but one remained curiously untouched. It depicted a family gathered around a dinner table. Their faces had faded into pale shadows. Only one figure remained perfectly preserved: a physician. His black medical bag rested beside his chair. His expression seemed strangely familiar, not because I recognized the man, because he looked directly at me. I cannot adequately describe the discomfort that seized me in that moment. It was not fear. It was the unpleasant certainty that I had interrupted someone else's memory. Holmes paid no attention to the painting. Instead, he wandered through the entrance hall with slow, deliberate movements, studying the floor, the ceiling, the damaged wallpaper, even the cracks between the wooden boards. To any observer, he might have appeared entirely directionless. Yet I knew that somewhere behind those quiet gray eyes an intricate design was steadily assembling itself. The deeper we ventured into the mansion, the colder the air became. Entire rooms remained untouched by dust, while neighboring chambers appeared buried beneath decades of neglect. Several clocks still occupied their places upon mantels and walls. None functioned. Every one displayed the same time: 11 minutes past 3. The coincidence unsettled me more than I cared to admit. At the end of a long corridor, we discovered what had once been a private library. Thousands of books still lined the towering shelves. Most had swollen with moisture until their pages resembled warped blocks of ivory. Near the fireplace stood a writing desk. Unlike everything surrounding it, the desk was perfectly clean. Not recently cleaned, simply untouched by time. Upon its surface rested an empty inkwell. Beside it lay a single sheet of yellow paper. Blank. Holmes lifted the page carefully. He did not inspect its surface. Instead, he turned it over and studied the reverse side beneath the fading afternoon light. For the first time since entering the estate, I noticed the faintest crease forming across his forehead. He slipped the paper inside his coat without explanation. The silence returned. It was then that I heard footsteps above us. Slow, measured, neither hurried nor cautious. They crossed the ceiling directly overhead before stopping. I looked toward Holmes. He had already begun climbing the staircase. There was no hesitation in him, no curiosity, only certainty. The second floor contained a row of bedrooms whose doors stood partially open, as though their occupants had stepped out only moments before. Each room carried the peculiar sensation of interrupted routine. Beds remained neatly made. Candles sat half-burned. Children's toys rested where small hands might easily have abandoned them. Nothing suggested panic. Everything suggested departure. Then we reached the final room. Its door stood closed. Holmes rested one hand upon the brass handle. For several long seconds, he neither moved nor spoke. At last he opened it. The room was empty, except for a single chair positioned in its exact center. Upon the chair rested an envelope. Its paper was yellow with age. Its wax seal remained unbroken. Across its front, written in handwriting I knew better than my own reflection, were 6 simple words. To Dr. John H. Watson. My heart slowed. Holmes did not touch the envelope. Neither did I. For reasons I still cannot explain, I felt with absolute certainty that the letter had been waiting for us long before either of us had ever heard the name Ashcroft. Long before Edward Fairchild disappeared. Perhaps long before I had been born. Outside, thunder rolled across the darkening countryside. The house answered with a low groan deep within its walls, as though ancient timber had shifted beneath an unbearable weight. Only years later would I understand that Ashcroft House did not remember the dead. It was waiting for them to return. I have often been asked whether courage is the absence of fear. It is not. A courageous man simply delays his fear until duty has been satisfied. That evening, standing inside the silent chamber of Ashcroft House, I discovered that duty itself could tremble. The envelope remained upon the lonely chair, untouched beneath the pale light that filtered through the cracked window. Dust drifted lazily around it, illuminated for only an instant before disappearing once again into the darkness. Nothing in that forgotten room seemed accidental. Every object occupied its place with the strange precision of a carefully arranged memory. Holmes stood perfectly still. His attention was fixed not upon the envelope but upon the floor surrounding the chair. He slowly circled the room, examining faded scratches in the wooden planks, the cracked plaster, and the uneven walls whose wallpaper had long ago surrendered to dampness and age. He neither hurried nor hesitated. Watching Holmes investigate was like watching a man read invisible sentences that no one else could even see. At last he nodded almost imperceptibly. Only then did he lift the envelope. The seal broke with a brittle crack that echoed far louder than it should have. Inside rested only a single folded page. No date, no address, only my own handwriting. A terrible sensation settled over me before I had read even the first word. It felt less as though I were discovering the contents than remembering them. The letter began without greeting. There will come a day when you question the manner of your own death. Do not waste your strength searching for a murderer. You will spend your final hours believing you failed Sherlock Holmes. That belief will be your greatest mistake. I could not continue. My hands had begun to shake. Not violently, only enough for the paper to rustle inside the silent room. Holmes accepted the letter from me without a word. He read every line twice. His expression never changed. That unnerved me more than anything written upon those impossible pages. Outside, the fading daylight surrendered completely to evening. Rain struck the broken windows in slow, irregular rhythms, as though someone walked endlessly around the house with patient footsteps. The mansion had become strangely alive after sunset. Wood expanded with low groans. Pipes hidden within the walls whispered with movements that resembled distant voices. More than once I believed I heard someone breathing somewhere beyond the corridor. Whenever I turned toward the sound, it vanished. Holmes continued deeper into the second floor. The rooms grew progressively stranger. One bedroom contained furniture coated beneath decades of dust. except for a single bedside table whose polished surface reflected our lantern perfectly. Another chamber displayed children's drawings covering an entire wall. Most had faded beyond recognition. One remained startlingly clear. It depicted two men standing beneath a dead tree. One carried a cane. The other wore a physician's coat. Neither possessed a face. I attempted to convince myself that countless interpretations were possible. Yet I knew precisely whom the drawing resembled. The feeling of being expected grew heavier with every passing minute. It was no longer the ordinary unease inspired by abandoned buildings. It resembled recognition. The house did not appear surprised that we had arrived. It seemed disappointed that we had taken so long. Near midnight, Holmes discovered a narrow staircase concealed behind an old bookcase. The mechanism that released it had rusted almost beyond movement. When the shelves finally shifted aside, a current of freezing air escaped from the darkness below. Stone steps descended beneath the house. Each carried a thin layer of dust untouched for many years. Except, halfway down the staircase appeared a series of footprints. Fresh, the same footprints we had discovered outside. Again they ended abruptly, as though their owner had simply ceased to exist. Holmes descended first. Our lantern revealed a long underground passage lined with shelves crowded by wooden boxes and forgotten records. Many had collapsed into heaps of mold and splintered timber. Others remained perfectly preserved. One cabinet bore a brass plaque, medical records. I felt my pulse quicken. Inside rested dozens of leather-bound journals. Every volume carried the name of a patient. Most belonged to people neither Holmes nor I had ever encountered. Then one spine caught my attention. Its leather appeared newer than the others. Far newer. Stamped across its cover in fading gold letters were 5 words. Dr. John H. Watson. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Holmes removed the journal carefully. Its pages appeared untouched. The first entries described my childhood with unsettling precision. My education, my military service in Afghanistan, my injury, my return to London. Every page recorded events exactly as they had happened. The handwriting remained my own, yet I had never written a single sentence. As I turned each page, the entries grew steadily closer to the present. My marriage, the cases shared with Holmes, the countless evenings at Baker Street, everything. Then, the writing continued beyond my own memory. Future dates, future conversations, future investigations, entire months of a life I had not yet lived. I reached the final written page. Only one sentence occupied its center. When Sherlock Holmes finally understands who sent the letters, he must not be allowed to fall asleep. Before either of us could speak, a heavy door slammed somewhere deep beneath the house. The echo rolled through the underground chambers like distant thunder. Then came footsteps, slow, measured, drawing nearer. Not one pair, several. Holmes quietly extinguished our lantern. Darkness swallowed us completely. For the first time since I had known him, I could no longer hear Sherlock Holmes breathing. Darkness has a peculiar way of altering the mind. When a man loses his sight, his imagination eagerly volunteers to replace it. Every distant scrape becomes a whisper. Every draft of cold air resembles a cautious breath. The world does not become empty in darkness. It becomes crowded. As Holmes extinguished our lantern, the underground passage disappeared entirely. The silence that followed seemed almost deliberate, as though the house itself wished to hear whatever approached us from the depths. The footsteps continued, slow, patient, never hurried. They echoed through the stone corridor with the rhythm of someone who knew precisely where we were. I resisted every instinct urging me to relight the lantern. Holmes had chosen darkness. That alone was enough. Minutes seemed to pass before the footsteps finally ceased. Not because whoever approached had turned away, because they had stopped directly in front of us. I could feel a presence only a few feet away. No breathing, no movement, only the unbearable certainty that someone stood between us and the passage leading back to the surface. Then, just as suddenly, the silence broke. A single sheet of paper drifted gently onto the stone floor. Nothing more. The footsteps resumed. This time they moved away. Neither Holmes nor I pursued them. When at last he struck a match, its weak flame illuminated the corridor once again. There was no one. The passage stretched empty in both directions. Only the paper remained. Holmes picked it up without hesitation. Unlike the previous letters, this page carried no envelope and no seal. It appeared to have been torn from the same journal bearing my name. Across its surface lay only a handful of carefully written sentences. Again, they were written in my own unmistakable hand. The final page must never reach daylight. If Holmes reads every line before sunrise, he will remember the dream. If he remembers the dream, he will never awaken from it. A strange expression crossed Holmes' face. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. It lasted only a heartbeat before disappearing beneath his usual composure. He folded the page and placed it inside his coat. Without explanation, he turned toward the staircase. I followed in silence. The journey back through Ashcroft House felt profoundly different from our arrival. The mansion no longer seemed abandoned, felt occupied. Every room appeared to be quietly observing our departure. Portraits that had once faded into darkness now seemed almost vivid beneath the trembling lantern light. Their eyes followed us. Or perhaps exhaustion had begun to cloud my judgment. The distinction no longer mattered. As we crossed the grand entrance hall, I noticed something that caused me to stop. The footprints. Those impossible footprints that had ended at the front door. They were gone. Not covered. Not disturbed. Gone. The dust lay smooth and untouched from wall to wall, as though no living creature had entered the house for decades. Holmes did not even glance toward the floor. He simply continued walking. Outside, dawn lingered somewhere beyond heavy clouds. The rain had finally ceased. Ashcroft House disappeared behind layers of pale mist until it resembled nothing more than a memory struggling to survive. Neither of us spoke during the journey back to Baker Street. Holmes spent the entire carriage ride staring through the window. From time to time, he reached into his coat, touching the folded page without removing it. He was measuring something, not the paper itself. Time. By the moment we reached London, an uncomfortable realization had begun to settle within me. Every warning contained in the letters concerned Holmes. Not me, not Edward Fairchild, not the vanished estate. Holmes, as though every impossible event had been arranged solely to lead him toward a single conclusion. That afternoon we returned to Baker Street. The familiar rooms should have brought comfort. Instead, they felt strangely unfamiliar. The fire burned exactly as we had left it. The violin rested upon its chair. My medical bag remained beside the sofa. Nothing had changed, except the clock. It had stopped. Its hands pointed toward 11 minutes past 3, the same impossible hour displayed by every clock inside Ashcroft House. Holmes noticed it immediately. He did not attempt to repair it. Instead, he opened the first letter once more, then the second, then the page from the underground chamber. He arranged them side by side across the table. Only then did I realize what he had already understood. Each document contained missing fragments, sentences broken midway, thoughts unfinished. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they formed something else entirely. One complete message. Holmes read it silently. His eyes moved from page to page with extraordinary speed. When he finished, he closed them. For the first time since this dreadful affair began, I saw genuine exhaustion settle across his face. He whispered only 4 words. "So that is why." I asked what he had discovered. He offered no reply. Instead, he carried every letter to the fireplace. The flames eagerly reached for the brittle paper. For one endless moment, I believed he intended to destroy every impossible page. Then he stopped. His hand remained suspended above the fire. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he withdrew the letters. "There is one page missing," he said. "Nothing more. No explanation. No theory. Only certainty." That night, neither of us retired to bed. Holmes remained seated beside the dying fire with the letters spread before him. I watched him from across the room until fatigue gradually overcame me. The last thing I remember before sleep claimed my thoughts was Holmes staring toward the darkened window. Not at his own reflection, at someone standing beyond it. Someone who appeared to be reading the very same letters from the opposite side of the glass. There are dreams from which a man awakens, and there are dreams that awaken before the man does. For years, I believed nightmares were nothing more than memories dressed in darkness. A guilty conscience, an old battlefield, the face of a forgotten patient. These things often return when reason surrenders itself to sleep. I no longer hold that belief. Some dreams arrive carrying intentions of their own. That final night at Baker Street possessed the heavy stillness of a world holding its breath. The fire had burned low, leaving only deep crimson embers that painted the room in fading light. Beyond the windows, London had vanished beneath a blanket of dense fog. Even the city seemed unwilling to interrupt whatever was about to unfold. Holmes had not moved for hours. The impossible letters remained spread across the table exactly as he had arranged them. Their faded ink seemed darker than before, almost fresh, as though the words had been rewritten while neither of us was looking. Sleep eventually overcame me. I remember closing my eyes for only a moment. When I opened them again, Baker Street had changed. The room appeared identical, yet every familiar object felt subtly misplaced. The violin rested upon the wrong chair. Mrs. Hudson's teapot stood on the opposite side of the fireplace. The wallpaper carried faint stains that had never existed. The house itself seemed to have remembered another version of its own history. Holmes remained seated before the letters. He was reading the missing page. The very page he had insisted did not exist. I could not see where it had come from. Perhaps it had always been there. Perhaps it had been waiting for someone willing to notice it. He turned the final sheet slowly. For the first time since I had known him, uncertainty crossed his face. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. The expression of a man discovering that the answer had been beside him since the very beginning. I rose to my feet, intending to ask what he had found. No sound escaped my lips. The room had become utterly silent. Even the fire no longer crackled. Then the clock began to tick. Once, twice, 3 times. Its frozen hands, locked for so long at 11 minutes past 3, began moving backward. Every tick stole another memory from the room. The books disappeared from the shelves. The newspapers faded. The violin dissolved into darkness. Even the walls of Baker Street seemed to peel away like old paint beneath invisible hands. Only Holmes remained, and the letters. He lifted the final page. His eyes traveled toward its last sentence. I still could not read the words, yet I somehow knew they contained my name. The fog outside the window thickened until it became impossible to distinguish the glass from the night beyond. A figure slowly emerged, tall, thin, perfectly motionless. His face remained hidden. His posture resembled Holmes himself. The figure raised one hand, not to knock, not to threaten, only to point, toward Holmes, then toward me, finally, toward the letters. The room shuddered, not violently, more like the quiet vibration that passes through a sleeper just before awakening. Holmes closed his eyes. His fingers tightened around the paper. The letters upon every page began to fade. Line by line, word by word, ink dissolved into blank parchment as though history itself had decided to erase the case before anyone could remember it. The stranger beyond the window vanished with the final sentence. Darkness swallowed everything. Then, Sherlock Holmes awoke. His eyes opened suddenly. Morning sunlight spilled through the familiar windows of 221B Baker Street. The fire had long since died. His violin rested exactly where it always had. The newspapers lay unopened beside the breakfast tray. No impossible letters covered the table. No footprints marked the floor. No Ashcroft House. No Edward Fairchild. No underground chamber. No journal bearing my name. Only silence. Holmes remained seated in his chair for several moments, breathing slowly as though returning from an immeasurable distance. He looked around the room with unusual care. Everything appeared ordinary, painfully ordinary. At last he allowed himself the faintest smile. "A dream," he murmured, "nothing more." He stood, straightened his dressing gown, and reached toward the morning correspondence Mrs. Hudson had left outside his door. Several envelopes, a newspaper, an invitation, one old yellow envelope. His hand stopped. The paper had aged with time. Its corners were worn. Its wax seal remained perfectly intact. Across the front, written in a familiar hand, appeared 6 quiet words. "To Sherlock Holmes. Open only after my death." Holmes stared at the handwriting without moving. He never broke the seal. Instead, he placed the envelope inside the drawer of his desk and quietly locked it away. Some mysteries, even to Sherlock Holmes, were never meant to be solved. As for me, if these words have somehow reached your hands, perhaps they were never written at all. Or perhaps every dream leaves behind a single piece of evidence. One letter, one warning, waiting patiently for the day someone finally decides to read it. I shall never forget the expression on Sherlock Holmes' face when the child smiled. It was not fear that crossed his features. Sherlock Holmes was a stranger to fear, nor was it surprise, for very little beneath heaven possessed the power to astonish that remarkable mind. It was recognition, a fleeting, almost imperceptible recognition, as though he had spent years searching for an answer and had suddenly found it standing before him beneath a dying oak tree. The boy smiled only once. Then every bell in the village began ringing. No hands pulled their ropes. No wind disturbed their towers. Yet each bell answered the next until the valley echoed with mournful iron voices. The villagers fell silent. Several lowered their heads. One elderly woman crossed herself with trembling fingers before quietly turning away, refusing to look at the child again. Holmes remained perfectly motionless. The boy simply watched him. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Looking back now, I often wonder whether the investigation truly began that afternoon, or whether it had begun more than a century before either Holmes or I first heard the village's forgotten name. Allow me, then, to begin where reason still possessed the illusion of control. The letter arrived during the final week of October, when London carried that familiar scent of damp brick, chimney smoke, and approaching winter. Rain drifted lazily across Baker Street, blurring the windows until the city beyond appeared little more than gray watercolor. Holmes occupied his chair beside the fireplace, surrounded by newspapers, chemical apparatus, and the organized disorder that only he could navigate without confusion. He had spoken scarcely a dozen words since breakfast. To anyone unfamiliar with him, his silence might have suggested idleness. I knew better. Holmes was never more dangerous than when he appeared to be doing absolutely nothing. Mrs. Hudson entered shortly after noon carrying the morning correspondence upon a silver tray. Among the usual collection of bills, invitations, and advertisements rested an envelope unlike the others. Its paper had darkened with age. The edges bore stains left by rain and rough handling. The address had been written carefully in faded black ink. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. No return address, no postal seal, only a faint impression of dried mud along one corner, reddish in color, unlike any soil I had seen in London. Holmes examined the envelope without opening it. His fingertips traced the fibers of the paper as though listening to a language beyond ordinary hearing. For several moments he merely held it beneath the light. Then he quietly placed it upon the table. He made no effort to break the seal. That alone surprised me. Curiosity had always been among his strongest qualities. Reluctance was not. Nearly an hour passed before he finally opened the envelope. Inside lay only a single folded sheet. The handwriting was remarkably elegant despite its age. There was no greeting, no signature, only a brief message. If reason alone is your companion, do not come. If you have ever doubted your own eyes, then you may still arrive in time. The boy has remained 9 years old for 112 years. Holmes read the note twice. Without comment, he handed it to me. I confess I smiled. It seemed the work of an imaginative prankster hoping to lure London's most celebrated detective into some provincial amusement. Yet Holmes did not smile. His attention had shifted to the final line, where a faint stain interrupted the ink. He studied it beneath a magnifying lens before quietly folding the paper once again. Only much later did I realize he had not been examining the handwriting. He had been studying the stain. By sunset, we had boarded a northbound train. Holmes carried almost nothing besides his violin, a notebook, and the anonymous letter. He spent most of the journey watching the passing countryside disappear into darkness. Occasionally, he glanced toward our reflection in the carriage window, not through it, at it, as though expecting to discover someone sitting behind us whom I could not see. The railway eventually surrendered to narrow country roads where a weathered carriage awaited our arrival. The driver greeted neither of us. He simply nodded toward the empty seats before urging the horses onward. Night settled quickly across the hills. Dense forests crowded the road from both sides, swallowing the moonlight beneath tangled branches. The deeper we traveled, the fewer signs of ordinary life remained. No distant cottages, no lanterns, no travelers, only endless woods and the slow rhythm of hooves striking wet earth. Several hours later, the carriage rolled into a secluded village hidden within a broad valley. Stone cottages leaned beneath heavy roofs blackened by generations of smoke. Their narrow windows reflected no welcoming light. The villagers had gathered in complete silence. Not one approached, not one greeted us. They simply watched. There was no hostility in their faces, only exhaustion, the peculiar exhaustion of people who have spent too many years waiting for something they cannot escape. An elderly clergyman finally stepped forward. His voice scarcely rose above a whisper. "You've come too late." Holmes asked no questions. The old man merely gestured toward the village square. There, beneath an ancient oak whose branches stretched across the darkness like enormous skeletal arms, stood a solitary child. He appeared no older than 9. His clothes belonged to another century. His shoes were polished despite the muddy ground. His pale hands rested calmly behind his back. He did not fidget. He did not blink. He simply observed the gathering crowd with remarkable patience. There was something profoundly unsettling about his stillness. Children are creatures of restless motion. They shift their weight. They glance toward distractions. They scratch, sigh, yawn, and chase every passing curiosity. This child behaved like an old man who had already witnessed every possible surprise the world could offer. As Holmes and I approached, the villagers instinctively stepped backward, widening the circle around him. No one spoke the boy's name. Indeed, I soon realized something stranger still. No one seemed willing to look directly into his eyes. The child slowly lifted his gaze toward Holmes. A gentle smile appeared upon his face. It was not cruel, nor welcoming. It resembled the smile one offers an acquaintance who has finally arrived for an appointment long overdue. Then he spoke, only 6 quiet words. "You took longer than last time." Holmes stopped walking. For the first time that evening, he said nothing. Chapter 2 Rules. Narrator: Dr. John H. Watson, first-person narration only. Language: American English. Style: dark noir, psychological horror, detective mystery. Audience: fans of horror and crime stories designed for nighttime listening. Dialogue is minimal. Emphasis is placed on immersive narration and slow-building suspense. Sherlock Holmes remains mysterious. His reasoning is never fully explained. Maintain a calm, unsettling pace suitable for bedtime listening. Chapter 2 of 6. Chapter 2: The Village Without Birthdays. There are villages that vanish from maps because they are abandoned. There are others that disappear because no one wishes them to be found. This village belonged to neither kind. It still existed upon paper, though only as a forgotten collection of narrow roads and weathered cottages hidden among endless forests. Travelers occasionally passed nearby, yet remarkably few ever entered its boundaries. Those who did seldom remained long enough to remember its name. The people called it Black Hollow. I suspect they had once called it something else. Names, much like people, sometimes grow old enough to be buried. The boy remained standing beneath the ancient oak long after darkness had settled over the valley. He had spoken only those 6 impossible words before falling silent once more. "You took longer than last time." The villagers reacted as though they had heard nothing unusual. No one questioned him. No one approached him. Instead, they quietly dispersed toward their homes, each person carefully avoiding the center of the square. Mothers gathered their children without speaking. Elderly men lowered their hats as they passed the tree. Even the village dogs refused to cross the circle of worn earth surrounding the boy. Only Holmes continued watching him. There are moments when Sherlock Holmes seemed less interested in people than in the spaces they occupied. That evening his attention wandered not to the child's face but to the ground beneath his feet. The soil around the oak had been trampled smooth over many decades. Countless footsteps had circled the tree, yet none appeared to lead directly toward it. The pattern resembled the flow of water around a stone lodged in the center of a stream. The villagers had unconsciously built their lives around avoiding that single place. The realization disturbed me far more than the child himself. Our lodgings had been prepared inside the modest home of the village physician, a widower whose quiet manners reflected the weary expression shared by nearly everyone in Black Hollow. Dust covered every shelf except one. Upon that shelf rested dozens of leather-bound journals arranged with almost military precision. Holmes examined them only briefly. He selected the oldest volume without hesitation. The physician offered no objection. Inside were records of births stretching back nearly 140 years. Each child born within the village had been carefully documented. Each baptism, each family name, each date, every page reflected extraordinary care. Yet something remarkable became apparent after only a few minutes. One page appeared again and again. Not literally. His handwriting differed. His ink had aged. His paper belonged to different decades. Yet the information never changed. Each generation had recorded the same child, always under a different physician, always by a different hand, always with identical words. Male. Estimated age, 9 years. No birthday, no parents, no family name. Only the same brief observation repeated every 20 or 30 years by men who had lived and died long before Holmes or I had ever drawn breath. One physician had added a single sentence in the margin. "He has not changed since my grandfather examined him." Another had written only, "Still waiting." Holmes quietly closed the final journal. His face remained unreadable. If the record surprised him, he concealed it perfectly. The physician prepared tea before excusing himself, leaving us alone beside the dimly burning fireplace. The room carried the comforting scent of dried herbs, old paper, and polished wood. Outside, however, another atmosphere prevailed. The village had become unnaturally silent. No laughter drifted through the streets. No footsteps echoed across the square. Even the wind seemed strangely reluctant to pass between the cottages. It was the silence of a place accustomed to listening. Unable to sleep, I wandered toward the front window sometime after midnight. The moon hung low above the valley, casting a silver haze over the rooftops. The oak tree stood exactly where we had left it. So did the boy. He had not moved. Hours had passed. Yet he remained standing beneath those ancient branches with his hands folded calmly behind his back, facing the empty road leading into the village. Not the houses, not the church, the road. as though patiently awaiting someone else's arrival. When I turned to mention the sight to Holmes, I discovered he was no longer inside the room. His chair stood empty. The front door had been left slightly open. Cold night air drifted quietly across the floorboards. I stepped outside. The square appeared deserted. Holmes was nowhere to be seen. Only the boy remained beneath the oak. He slowly raised one hand, not toward me, toward something standing beyond my shoulder. I turned immediately. Nothing. The empty street stretched away beneath pale moonlight. When I looked back, the child had lowered his arm. His expression had not changed. Neither had his patient smile. At dawn, Holmes returned. His boots carried fresh mud, unlike the soil surrounding the village. Dark red, the same peculiar color that had stained the anonymous letter in Baker Street. He offered no explanation. Instead, he placed a small object upon the breakfast table, an old black and white photograph. The image showed villagers gathered beneath the very same oak tree. Judging by their clothing, it had been taken at least 70 years earlier. Men in worn coats, women wearing heavy Victorian dresses, children standing quietly beside them. Near the center of the photograph, the same boy, the same face, the same calm smile, not a single year younger, not a single year older. Holmes studied the photograph for several long moments before placing it inside his notebook. Only then did he speak. His voice was little more than a whisper. "Someone in this village is lying." He did not say everyone, only someone, and somehow, I believed that troubled him far more. Morning brought no comfort to Black Hollow. The fog that blanketed the valley did not rise with the sun. Instead, it lingered among the cottages like an unwelcome guest that had forgotten the meaning of departure. The pale light merely transformed the mist into something visible, revealing a village that seemed exhausted by the burden of another day. The people spoke little. Even ordinary tasks carried the solemn rhythm of ritual. A woman swept the same section of her porch for nearly an hour without appearing to notice she had accomplished nothing. Two elderly men repaired a stone wall already standing perfectly upright. Children walked quietly beside their parents, never laughing, never running, and never glancing toward the great oak in the center of the square. The tree remained the silent heart of the village. The boy was gone. Not one villager seemed relieved by his absence. Their expressions suggested something far worse: expectation. Holmes spent the morning wandering through Black Hollow with no apparent destination. To an observer unfamiliar with his methods, he would have appeared hopelessly distracted. He paused beside abandoned wells, studied weathered fences, measured shadows cast by rooftops, and occasionally stood motionless for several minutes, observing places where nothing at all seemed worthy of attention. I had long ago learned that Holmes often investigated absence rather than presence. He searched for what should have existed but did not. By midday, our path carried us beyond the final row of cottages toward a neglected estate overlooking the valley. Its iron gates leaned crooked upon broken hinges. The gravel road had disappeared beneath decades of moss and weeds. A cracked marble fountain stood silent before the entrance, its basin filled with rainwater as black as polished obsidian. The villagers had warned us not to enter. Curiously, none had offered a reason. The manor had once belonged to the Ashbourne family, whose name survived only in fading church records and whispered conversations abruptly interrupted whenever strangers approached. Time had nearly erased the house, yet not completely. Its enormous windows reflected the gray sky with unsettling clarity, while ivy climbed every wall like veins spreading beneath pale skin. Holmes approached without hesitation. The great oak door yielded with remarkable ease despite its apparent age. Inside, the air carried the unmistakable scent of old wood, dust, damp stone, and forgotten memories. Silence settled heavily upon every room. It was not the peaceful silence of abandonment. It resembled the silence inside an empty theater moments before the curtain rises. The entrance hall stretched upward through 3 stories, where a magnificent staircase curved toward shadowed galleries above. Portraits lined every wall, hundreds of them. Generations of the Ashbourne family stared solemnly from ornate gilded frames whose craftsmanship had survived even as the faces within slowly surrendered to age. Holmes ignored the grand staircase entirely. Instead, he began examining the paintings one by one. His pace remained slow, measured, almost reverent. Only after several minutes did I begin noticing what had captured his attention. It was not the nobles, nor their clothing, nor the artist's signatures. It was the background. In nearly every portrait, regardless of the decade depicted, a child appeared somewhere behind the principal subject. Sometimes standing beneath a tree, sometimes watching from an upstairs window, sometimes reflected faintly in polished glass. Never at the center, always observing, the same pale face, the same dark coat, the same expressionless eyes, the same impossible age. 9 years old, always 9. The oldest portrait dated from the late 18th century. The newest had been completed less than 20 years before our arrival. More than a century separated them. The child had not changed by a single day. I moved closer to one enormous family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Its colors had faded considerably. The painter had captured an elegant dinner gathering illuminated by candlelight. 7 adults occupied the table. A servant poured wine. No children were present. At least, none had been intended. Near the rear wall stood an antique mirror. Within its reflection, where no figure should have appeared, stood the same boy, watching the painter, watching us. A chill traveled slowly through me. The child had not been painted as part of the family. He had been painted as part of the house. Holmes remained silent. His fingertips drifted lightly across the gilded frame before continuing toward another portrait. Each discovery only deepened the mystery. The artists themselves had changed. The fashions had changed. Entire generations had passed. Yet the child remained untouched by time. Hours slipped away inside that forgotten mansion. The deeper we ventured, the stranger its collection became. One corridor displayed unfinished canvases stacked carelessly against the walls. Most had deteriorated beyond recognition. One remained almost perfectly preserved beneath a torn linen cloth. The painting had never been completed. Its lower half showed only rough sketches. Yet the face of the child had been rendered with astonishing precision. Far more detail than any other figure. It was as though the artist had considered nothing else worthy of finishing. Holmes examined the dried paint with unusual interest. Without warning, he stepped backward. Only once. His eyes lifted toward the high ceiling. I followed his gaze. Fresh footprints crossed the thick layer of dust covering the gallery above us. Small footprints, bare feet. They began at one end of the corridor. They ended directly above the unfinished portrait. There was no staircase leading upward, no ladder, no broken floorboards, nothing. Only the impossible trail suspended beyond our reach. A faint creaking echoed somewhere overhead. Not the groan of settling timber. Footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate. Neither Holmes nor I moved. The sound continued across the ceiling until it stopped directly above us. Silence returned. Then, very gently, a single object drifted downward from the darkness above. It landed without a sound upon the dusty floor. An old paintbrush. Its bristles were still wet. The deeper we ventured, the stranger its collection became. One corridor displayed unfinished canvases stacked carelessly against the walls. Most had deteriorated beyond recognition. One remained almost perfectly preserved beneath a torn linen cloth. The painting had never been completed. Its lower half showed only rough sketches. Yet the face of the child had been rendered with astonishing precision. Far more detail than any other figure. It was as though the artist had considered nothing else worthy of finishing. Holmes examined the dried paint with unusual interest. Without warning, he stepped backward. Only once. His eyes lifted toward the high ceiling. I followed his gaze. Fresh footprints crossed the thick layer of dust covering the gallery above us. Small footprints, bare feet. They began at one end of the corridor. They ended directly above the unfinished portrait. There was no staircase leading upward, no ladder, no broken floorboards, nothing. Only the impossible trail suspended beyond our reach. A faint creaking echoed somewhere overhead. Not the groan of settling timber. Footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate. Neither Holmes nor I moved. The sound continued across the ceiling until it stopped directly above us. Silence returned. Then, very gently, a single object drifted downward from the darkness above. It landed without a cemetery reveals far more about the living than it ever does about the dead. The monuments men build are not for those resting beneath the earth. They are desperate negotiations with memory. Black Hollow possessed only a single cemetery. It rested upon a lonely hillside overlooking the village, where rows of weathered gravestones leaned beneath centuries of rain and relentless winter winds. Ancient yew trees surrounded the burial ground so completely that even daylight seemed reluctant to enter. The villagers avoided the place, not because they feared the dead, because they feared one grave among them. The parish priest led us there shortly after dawn. His footsteps slowed as we climbed the narrow path, and more than once I noticed him glancing over his shoulder toward the valley below. The village looked strangely peaceful from that height. Thin columns of smoke drifted from stone chimneys, and the great oak dominated the square like a silent guardian whose purpose had long been forgotten, or perhaps remembered too well. The priest stopped before a modest headstone almost consumed by moss. Unlike the surrounding graves, fresh flowers rested at its base. Someone had replaced them recently. Every morning, the priest admitted. No one had ever confessed to leaving them. Holmes knelt without speaking. His fingertips brushed away a thin layer of damp moss. Beneath it appeared an inscription worn smooth by more than a century of weather. Elias Ashbourne, born, unknown, died, October 17, 1814, aged 9 years. There was no family epitaph, no comforting scripture, only those few impossible words. Aged 9 years. Holmes studied the stone for several minutes. Not the name, not the date, the empty space surrounding both, as though something had once been carved there and later erased with extraordinary care. He rose slowly and began walking around the grave in widening circles. His attention settled upon the ground itself. The grass surrounding the headstone grew unusually short despite no visible signs of maintenance. Rainwater had drained away from the soil more quickly than elsewhere in the cemetery, leaving the earth unnaturally firm beneath our boots. Holmes pressed the tip of his cane gently into the ground. The sound that answered was wrong. It was hollow, very hollow. The priest lowered his eyes. I told them not to open it again. Again. The word lingered in the cold morning air. Holmes looked toward him. The old man hesitated before continuing. The grave, he explained, had been opened 3 separate times over the last century. The first occurred during renovations after a violent storm exposed part of the coffin. The second happened when scholars from London arrived hoping to dismiss the local legends. The third, no records survived. Only whispered recollections passed between generations. Each excavation ended the same way. The coffin was always empty. Holmes neither questioned nor challenged the story. Instead, he quietly requested permission to examine the grave himself. The priest reluctantly agreed. By late afternoon, several laborers had gathered with shovels beneath the gray sky. None appeared comfortable with the task. Each man crossed himself before the first shovel pierced the earth. The work progressed slowly. The soil seemed strangely compact despite recent rain, as though untouched for decades. Layer after layer disappeared until weathered oak finally emerged beneath the damp earth. The coffin had survived remarkably well. Iron fittings, blackened by age, still clung stubbornly to its surface. The lid bore deep scratches, not from tools, from fingers. Countless narrow grooves covered the wood, all running toward the edges as though someone trapped inside had searched desperately for escape. I reminded myself such marks often appeared naturally after years beneath shifting soil. Reason offered explanations. The imagination rejected them. The laborers pried open the lid. A stale current of cold air escaped from the coffin. Inside, nothing. No bones. No clothing. No fragments of decay. Only a layer of fine gray dust resting upon bare wood. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Even the wind had vanished. Holmes leaned over the empty coffin. His eyes moved slowly across its interior. Then, without warning, he reached inside. He removed something so small I nearly failed to notice it. A marble, perfectly round, deep blue. Its polished surface reflected the fading daylight with remarkable clarity. The object looked absurdly ordinary inside that impossible grave. Holmes slipped it quietly into his pocket. He offered no explanation. As the laborers began replacing the coffin, I became aware of movement beyond the cemetery wall. A child stood among the yew trees, too distant for his features to be clearly seen. Yet I recognized the outline immediately. The same narrow shoulders, the same dark coat, the same patient stillness. He watched us for several moments before disappearing behind the trees without making a sound. No branches moved, no leaves rustled. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed him. Dusk settled quickly across Black Hollow. The villagers gathered silently outside the church as we descended from the cemetery. No one asked what we had discovered. They already knew. Their expressions revealed neither surprise nor fear, only disappointment. The disappointment of people who had hoped, against all reason, that this time the coffin might finally contain a body. That evening Holmes remained unusually withdrawn. He spread several old maps across the table inside the physician's house and studied them beneath a single oil lamp. The blue marble rested beside his notebook. From time to time, he rolled it gently beneath one finger, watching the tiny sphere catch the light. Hours passed. Not a word escaped him. Just before midnight, he stood abruptly and walked toward the window. Outside, the village square lay empty. The ancient oak swayed gently in the night breeze. Beneath it, a fresh mound of earth had appeared. No one had buried anything there that day. Holmes quietly picked up his coat. Without looking away from the window, he spoke the only sentence he had uttered all evening. "The grave," he murmured, "is in the wrong place." He left the house before I could ask what he meant. For reasons I could not explain, I was no longer certain he had been speaking about the cemetery. Memory is a curious companion. It grows less faithful with every passing year, polishing some moments until they shine while allowing others to crumble quietly into darkness. Entire decades may disappear, yet a single forgotten afternoon can survive with impossible clarity. I had always believed memory belonged only to the living. Black Hollow persuaded me otherwise. Holmes disappeared shortly after midnight. He neither invited me to follow nor instructed me to remain behind. By then I understood that whenever silence replaced his explanations, he had already reached a conclusion that words could not yet support. Unable to sleep, I walked alone through the sleeping village. Mist drifted slowly between the cottages, softening every corner and swallowing every distant sound. Even my own footsteps seemed reluctant to disturb the night. The lamps hanging above the narrow streets burned with weak yellow flames that barely pierced the fog. The great oak stood exactly where it always had. The fresh mound of earth beneath its branches remained undisturbed. The child was sitting upon it, not standing, not wandering, simply sitting with both hands folded neatly in his lap, gazing toward the empty church as though waiting for a service that had ended generations ago. For the first time since our arrival, I approached him without Holmes beside me. The distance between us closed slowly. 20 yards, 10, 5. He never turned his head. He seemed to know precisely where I was. When I finally stood before him, I realized how extraordinarily ordinary he appeared. His cheeks carried the healthy color of childhood. His shoes bore fresh mud. His coat showed careful stitching where older fabric had been repaired countless times. There was nothing ghostly about him, nothing transparent, nothing unnatural, only one impossible fact. Time had abandoned him. He lifted his eyes toward mine. There was no malice in them, no innocence either, only patience. The sort of patience one might expect from a man who had spent an entire century waiting for a delayed train. "You were a soldier." His voice remained soft, almost gentle. I felt no surprise. Many people knew of my military service. Then he continued, "You still wake before sunrise whenever rain strikes the windows." The word struck me harder than I cared to admit. Very few people knew that. Even Holmes had never mentioned it. The child continued watching me quietly. "You still carry the bullet that nearly killed you." Instinctively, my hand moved toward the old scar upon my shoulder. He smiled faintly. "You never removed it." A cold uneasiness settled over me. These were not remarkable deductions. They were memories. My memories. He spoke again, not asking, remembering. "You once promised yourself you would never leave another wounded man behind." The valley seemed to grow colder. That promise had never been spoken aloud. I had made it alone beneath a ruined stone wall in Afghanistan while listening to a young lieutenant die before dawn. No living soul had heard those words, not even Sherlock Holmes. The child lowered his gaze toward the ground. "I remember." That simple sentence lingered in the silence. Not I know, not I guessed. I remember. Before I could gather my thoughts, slow footsteps emerged from the mist. "Holmes." He approached without haste, his long coat damp with dew collected from the surrounding fields. His expression revealed nothing, yet something in his posture suggested that he had expected to find us together. He looked first at the child, then at me, finally at the mound of fresh earth beneath us. No one spoke. The silence stretched comfortably between them, almost like the quiet shared by two old acquaintances. The child reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch darkened by age. He offered it to Holmes. Holmes accepted it immediately. No hesitation, no curiosity, only acceptance. Inside rested dozens of blue marbles identical to the one recovered from the empty coffin. Each reflected the moonlight like a tiny frozen eye. Several carried faint scratches. Others appeared almost new. Holmes gently rolled one across his palm. The child watched him. Then he whispered something so softly I scarcely heard it. "They all forgot." Holmes closed the pouch. His eyes remained fixed upon the marbles. For several long moments neither moved. At last the child turned toward me again. His calm voice carried no emotion. "I attended your funeral." Every sound in the valley disappeared. "I stood beneath the rain beside the old oak where they buried your favorite cane." My heart seemed to stop. No such funeral had taken place. I was standing there, alive, breathing. Yet the certainty with which he spoke left no room for imagination. He was not predicting. He was recalling. The church bell rang once. A deep, lonely note drifted across Black Hollow. When its echo faded, the child was gone. There had been no movement, no footsteps. One heartbeat he sat before us. The next, the mound of earth lay empty beneath the ancient tree. Only damp grass remained where his shoes had rested. Holmes slowly opened the leather pouch once more. He counted the blue marbles without touching them. Then he closed it again. "We leave at sunrise." Nothing more. No explanation. As we returned through the silent village, I glanced back toward the oak. For an instant I thought I saw dozens of small figures standing beneath its branches. Children, all the same height, all perfectly still. The fog drifted between them. When it cleared only moments later, the tree stood alone. Yet one unsettling thought refused to leave me. Throughout the entire conversation, the child had never once asked my name. He had spoken to me as though we had already known each other for a very long time. There is a common belief that every mystery possesses a solution. Years spent beside Sherlock Holmes taught me something far less comforting. Every mystery possesses an answer. Whether that answer satisfies the human mind is another matter entirely. We departed Black Hollow shortly after sunrise. The villagers gathered silently beside the road, just as they had gathered when we first arrived. No one waved. No one thanked Holmes. Their expressions carried neither relief nor disappointment. It was the look of people who had witnessed another season pass without changing the burden they carried. The ancient oak stood alone in the center of the square. The boy was nowhere to be seen. As our carriage disappeared into the morning mist, I looked back one final time. The village itself seemed strangely smaller than I remembered, almost as though distance were causing it to fade from the world. Holmes remained silent throughout the journey. The leather pouch containing the blue marbles rested inside his coat. Only once did he remove a single marble and hold it toward the carriage window. Sunlight passed through the blue glass. Tiny imperfections hidden within its center became visible. Not air bubbles, letters, extremely small letters. Someone had engraved every marble. Holmes smiled faintly. It was the first smile I had seen since receiving the anonymous letter in Baker Street. By the time we reached London, his silence had ended. Without drama, without triumph, he quietly placed one marble into my hand. Inside the glass, almost invisible unless held against the light, appeared a date. 1814, another marble. 1841, another. 1878. Each carried a different year. Nothing else. I began to understand. Or rather, I believed I did. Holmes never confirmed my suspicions. Instead, he spread the marbles across the table at Baker Street beside the parish records, the physician's journals, and the photographs we had brought from Black Hollow. Patterns slowly emerged. Every date matched the year a child had disappeared from the surrounding counties. Not died, disappeared. The police reports remained unsolved. The newspapers eventually forgot them. The families never did. The villagers of Black Hollow had woven those tragedies together into a single legend. Each generation inherited the same story. Whenever another child vanished somewhere in the region, people whispered that the boy who never grew older had taken another birthday for himself. Fear completed the work that memory began. The photographs, the portraits, the journals, the repeated descriptions. Each generation copied what the previous generation believed. The legend strengthened itself until no one could separate truth from tradition. Even the empty grave possessed an explanation. There had never been a body, only a coffin prepared for a child who was never found. A memorial had slowly transformed into a tomb. A tomb had become a myth. It was, in many respects, one of the saddest cases Holmes had ever encountered. Not because monsters existed, but because grief could survive long enough to become one. For several hours I believed the mystery solved. Then Holmes opened the leather pouch one final time. Something lay hidden beneath the marbles. A folded piece of paper. Its edges had yellowed with age. The handwriting belonged to no one we had met. Holmes unfolded it carefully. The note contained only a single sentence. If he ever asks your name, leave the village before sunset. Nothing more. No signature. No explanation. Holmes quietly folded the paper again. The child never asked anyone's name, I observed. No. He seemed to know everyone. Yes, and he never asked mine. Holmes looked toward the fire. For a long time he offered no reply. When he finally spoke, his voice had become almost thoughtful. He asked someone else's. I waited. He said nothing further. The case was officially closed within a fortnight. London newspapers dismissed Black Hollow as another example of provincial superstition. The missing children remained unsolved. The portraits were returned to the abandoned manor. Life continued, as life always insists upon doing. Months passed, then years. I seldom thought of Black Hollow after that, until one rainy autumn afternoon. I was organizing old case notes inside Baker Street when an envelope slipped from between the pages of my journal. I did not remember placing it there. The paper was old, far older than the notebook itself. Inside rested a faded photograph. I had never seen it before. It showed a group of schoolchildren standing outside a stone building. The clothing suggested the photograph had been taken sometime around 1900. Every child smiled toward the camera. Every teacher stood proudly behind them, except one. Near the edge of the photograph, almost hidden beneath the shadow of a tree, stood the same boy, 9 years old, hands folded behind his back, watching the photographer instead of the camera. On the reverse side, someone had written, in faded black ink, "Class of 1901." Below it, in handwriting I recognized immediately as Sherlock Holmes's, were 6 quiet words. This photograph was taken yesterday. I looked up from the picture. Holmes sat across the room with his violin resting upon one knee. He met my eyes. For the briefest moment, he smiled, not because he had solved the mystery, but because he knew some mysteries are far more valuable unsolved. The fire crackled softly. Rain tapped against the windows of Baker Street, and somewhere very far away, perhaps beneath an ancient oak in a forgotten village, a 9-year-old boy quietly celebrated another birthday without growing a single day older.